Welcome to Mental Health Matters. I'm your host, Nancy Bacci. I'm fortunate today to have a wonderful colleague as a guest, Hallory Mogren, Clinical Youth Specialist with the City of Somerville. Thank you so much for taking time to come on today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Excellent. So before we dive into the topic of mental health and wellness, which we could talk forever about because it is so critical, let's set a little bit about what drew you to wanting to work for the City of Somerville and a little bit about your background.
So I've been with the city for about 4 years now. I'm a licensed mental health counselor and a trained art therapist. I've been in the field for close to 16 years now, which is scary. And I've worked primarily with children and youth and some adult work. And I've done mostly trauma work. I've worked in juvenile justice. I've worked in private practice, and just prior to coming to the city, I worked for a grant-funded trauma program helping youth survivors of traumatic victimization. And I think I'm really passionate about always trying to look at things through a creative lens. And as a result of sort of my different experiences and the work that I've done, I've become really passionate about social justice and really wanting to be able to have an impact on policy. So I think that's also part of why I wanted to come work for the city.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting, you know, people sometimes have different perspectives about local government, and once you become enmeshed in the work, it really is interesting to kind of see how the ripple effect of things or an initiative here then informs a policy later. So I think one of the things that most excited us when we brought you on board was that creative lens that you do utilize. So I think that it's a real benefit to our community to have someone with that sort of thinking and skill set on board as a staff person. So it's great to have the opportunity to talk a little bit more with you and really send some information out into the city residents as well.
Thank you.
Excellent. So we know March 2nd is World Teen Mental Health Day.
Yes.
So doesn't quite roll off the tongue as much, but I am glad to see that there is a focus for that when we think of the challenges of our young people in our community and just kind of the breadth of all that as well. So as you know, it's a fairly new observance, if you'd like to chat a bit about that.
Yeah, so it's a relatively new awareness day. It was first recognized in 2020, and I was thinking about it. I think, ironically, that's of course when the pandemic really sort of hit. I think that was a coincidence. I think it was sort of, we didn't quite know what the significance or the impact of that was going to be quite at that time. And so, you know, it's only been about 5 years now. It's sort of in contrast with sort of Mental Health Awareness Month, which is also coming up in May. That's been around since 1949. So just to show the difference there. But for Teen Mental Wellness Day, that's really to sort of highlight the specific challenges that are facing youth right now. And so I think it's important that we sort of recognize that there are differences and really sort of look and explore sort of the challenges that youth are facing.
It's interesting you say that. As I was prepping for this as well, I was thinking back and trying to envision, you know, March 2nd of 2020, and it was like things were just kind of on an even keel.
Yeah.
And it was nice to see the focus on teens, but also in contrast, as you said, to the broader, you know, May with an entire month of awareness and really looking at it in a more holistic way. And it was intriguing to me to be like, oh, the focus on teens, because, you know, that's your favorite area, that's my favorite area of that definitely that population. And then the irony of it happening, starting its first observance right before COVID, and the impacts of the pandemic and how that shifted everyone's ability to really focus on their mental well-being at a time that felt complete and utter chaos. And, you know, as we're marking the 5-year on vinyl post-COVID time, it really is so interesting to see how that impacted everyone in the moment, but thinking of young people and the loss of significant occasions and all of that. So it really is just interesting that we're doing this now as the anniversary is kind of coming up. So when we think of, in your experience in connecting with young people, for what occurred during the pandemic, in that sense, we know very broadly, a lot of youth reported anecdotally feeling parentified and kind of taking on that role of responsibility for other siblings in their home. We know when education switched to an online platform, challenges around finding a space for that, being able to be fully invested, privacy challenges, just 1,000 variables, right, when we start thinking about that. What are your thoughts on that for young people during that time?
Well, so, and you and I have talked about this. You know what, I think what's really interesting is that the pandemic really sort of highlighted issues that, and exacerbated issues that were already existing. So we know, you know, statistically we know that that there was an increase in mental health amongst youth. And statistics don't always paint the full picture, I like to point out, but they do provide us with some information. And so we know that there were increases in sort of mental health diagnoses, symptoms, pretty much across the board. We also know that prior to the pandemic, there were already youth were already experiencing an increase in those symptoms and diagnoses. So I think that those are important things to recognize, is that the pandemic just really sort of exacerbated an already existing issue. And, you know, we can certainly look at that and sort of theorize, but it's difficult to know exactly to what extent. You know, we certainly know some of the factors that really exacerbated or impacted mental health symptoms were the increased isolation. And, you know, it varied for everybody a little bit. It's hard to sort of say that this was true for every single child across the board. But we certainly know that the increased isolation was a huge factor for people. Because that cut off external supports that many youth had, regardless of the supports that were available in home, sort of those external supports, access to people outside the home, including friends. You know, that really impacts your mental health. Other things that we know sort of increased or made things more challenging, I should say, is you know, basic needs. So the pandemic,
still seeing the impact of that.
We're absolutely still seeing the impact of that. So that was really something that those stressors around access to basic needs, food, housing, and security, healthcare, that was something. I think something that a lot of people also maybe don't recognize as much, even though it's very clear, you know, how much it happened, was the number of youth that were dealing with grief and loss during that period. And that's also something that doesn't really have a timeline. You know, there were a number of youth that had to deal with, you know, different types of loss too, right? We think about loss as death, I think, but there's also different types of loss that people can experience. And then I think another thing that's important to recognize too is that home is not always a safe place for youth. And that can mean a lot of different things. It can mean that home might just be really chaotic. And home sometimes may not be literally a physically or psychologically safe place for kids. And so during peak COVID times, some kids or teens lost access to places that were otherwise those safe places that they used. So whether that was school, a library, even a job maybe. So some of those external places. So I think that's, you know, I think those were all things, all different factors that we saw that really exacerbated, impacted, led to sort of some of those increased mental health symptoms that we're, as you pointed out, still seeing the impact of.
Right, and I think too, to go back to a couple of points that you made, because I think it's really important to emphasize, when we think of kind of the individual places that we occupy in our lives, right? Like we live at home, we go to our jobs, you know, we socialize, things like that. But when you think of teens and the reliance on structures, right? So you have to be at school at a certain time. If you have a job, you have time allocated to do your homework, time for hanging out with your friends. And thinking, and this relates to what we see in the student health survey information as well, about other trusted adults in a young person's life.
Yes.
So understanding that sometimes obvious, sometimes kind of under the radar connection. So even if a teen is not, high-fiving someone at the school, a staff person or someone they see in the hallway, there still can be such a level of connectedness to that person. And when that is removed, I think that everyone felt adrift because of just the uncertainty of being in a pandemic. But then when you start really parsing out these very concrete talismans that worked in people's lives to keep them grounded or to know that there was another set of eyes on you, and the loss of those, I think, to reference your point about grief, feels very different in a way that, attention has to be paid to. We hear a lot of language about like resetting or coming back from, and I don't dismiss that. It's important that we all find a place to continue to move on from. But I think the weight and the seriousness of that, those type of losses, sometimes isn't really factored in. And when we start thinking of the resiliency of teens, right? Like, I think there's a whole spectrum of how people feel about that, including the teens themselves. Sometimes it's like, if the sense of can't get anything right and I need everybody to support me. The other part is like, I have everything under control. So that pendulum swings very broadly, and thinking of the need for the safety of that, as you alluded to, physical, psychological, mental, just all of that feeling that you are centered and grounded feels like it was super hard for adults with many more years of experience to navigate. And then we think of the pressures that puts on our young people. So again, it's nice to have this day to kind of draw awareness to that, but I think it's something that we as adults who are responsible for caring for young people in our community really need to be focusing on every day.
Absolutely. I think structure is hugely important. Even sometimes we know that everybody maybe fights back against it, maybe kids especially, but we know that that's predictable. And so a lot of times chaos can feel really traumatic because we don't know what's going to happen. And so even, when I worked in juvenile justice, we had some staff that the youth did not like because they didn't disagree with sort of how they approached certain things. But the staff was predictable, and they always did it that way, and so the youth sort of could depend on that they could rely on that. And so a lot of youth actually loved that staff for that reason, because it was predictable, it was routine. The staff did not, they were not changing how they approached the work. They were strict, but they always did it like that. Whereas I think sometimes that flexibility, that chaos, may be preferable because it feels like there's more flexibility, but it's not predictable, and that can be really challenging.
I think that's hard to navigate. When you start thinking of protective factors, particularly for teens, it is that sense of familiarity, comfort, routine, something that allows you to feel plugged in and connected at a time when you may not feel connected in other areas as well. So I think that grounding is so critical. And, leading into our next discussion topic is how to talk to young people about mental health, right? And we think of the stigma. I have a lot of variables. We start thinking of the stigma associated with that, progress that has been made around that. And I think after we talk that through a little bit, I think we can also spend a moment talking about the impact of social media on that. So we could do a whole other show just on that. But why don't we just start with engaging youth to talk specifically about their own mental wellness? So
again, I think this could be this could be like an hour-long more conversation.
This could be a several-month-long series.
Yeah. I think this is something that's challenging. It's incredibly nuanced, and it depends on a lot of factors. I think it depends on your relationship with the youth that you're trying to talk to. If it's your child, you know, obviously it's different. If it's if you're just a caring adult, you know, it may be a separate conversation. So any tips I sort of provide right now, I would just keep sort of that in mind, that this is a very general conversation. And I would also add that the conversation looks a lot different depending on the severity of your concerns too. And so that's, I think, always important to keep in mind when you're talking to somebody about their mental health, particularly a youth. I think first and foremost, I would just always advise to approach it with an open mind. And I think making just some general observations to the teen, to the youth, and offering space to talk can be helpful. And again, this depends on your relationship with the youth. So I think, you know, this might look like observing, you know, hey, you know, I've noticed you've seemed sad the past few weeks, or I've noticed you haven't been spending time with your friends. Just whatever you have observed that leads you to be concerned for their mental health. Just making those sort of observations and then offering to talk. Is there anything you want to talk about? This is what I'm noticing. Do you want to, you know, do you feel like this? Is there something you want to talk about? And just sort of starting with that. And then I would follow the teens or the youth's lead, depending on sort of how that goes.
I think it's important to note as well, naming things, right?
Yeah.
I think that sometimes we all need to practice being comfortable with uncomfortable conversations and really, as you said, coming into it open-minded and with a sense of, you know, we don't have all the answers. It's a dialogue. It's a space to go back and forth. But I think really being able to, if you are, as you indicated, a caring adult wanting to support a teen, you have to also be ready to hear things that you intuitively may not want to hear or that cause you to feel uncomfortable. And I think it's that balance between, you want to position yourself. Every young person should have as many caring adults in their lives as humanly possible, whatever form that takes, coach, teacher, parents, friend, anything like that. But also really, you're easing yourself into this at the time you're easing the teen in, knowing that you have to be open to receiving that type of information. And I think really coming from a place of non-judgment is so critical to establishing that rapport with teens, because they can sniff out when you're faking super quickly. And you want to be genuine so that you have that, you become another trusted adult for them.
And it may be acknowledging that too, as the adult. Like if you're struggling with that, it might be okay to say, I'm going to do my best here, and this is what I'm having a hard time with. It's okay to acknowledge that too. We want to try not to make it the conversation about us as adults, but if you're having a hard time, you might say, you know, I think it's more important to acknowledge that piece, to say, but I really want to focus on what's going on with you.
Right. That's good to note that. And I also think, to what you just said, I think people sometimes, when people are engaged in something that's uncomfortable, it's a sense of wanting to find commonality, and that shifts the focus from the teen. Like, you know, I think that we all have heard the phrase, you know, about people that are well-intended, and that's great. But you don't want the conversation to diverge. If you're trying to draw a parallel between an experience of your own and that of the teen, in the sense of wanting to foster connection, we as adults need to be mindful that it's not really fostering connection so much as kind of shifting the focus. So there needs to be a way to be supportive and acknowledge that as adults, we also don't have all the answers or have ourselves completely together too, but you don't want to take over that chat.
Yeah, I think it's about finding that balance. And sometimes that can be a good way to open the conversation or have a teen open up. And so I think it's about finding the balance between how you find the connection and make sure that the focus stays on the youth or your teen. And I think sort of the idea of being non-judgmental, I think a lot of times what happens when adults are, or anybody is talking to a teen, we tend to make the experience around what we perceive it to be.
Yes.
Instead of really trying to hear what how the youth is describing sort of their experience. And so I think what's really important is that we just genuinely try to listen, not judgmentally, and try to understand the teen's experience, how they are truly experiencing it, and not trying to minimize it or talk to them how we perceive it to be. And that, I think sometimes, this is an example, but for example, if a teen is sort of opening up about something that's going on with a friend group or something, our immediate response might be to say something like, "Oh, this will blow over. It's something with your friends," or, "You're going to have new friends in a few years," and that may be true. And there may be another time in a few weeks where you're having a different conversation that's more in depth about that piece, but in that moment when the teen is sort of opening up to you about what's happening, I think it's really important that we just allow them to sort of express what's going on, how they're feeling about it, and just allow that piece to happen.
I think too there's so much to be said about being in the moment with someone, and also you think of how you present in conversations, right? Is your body language open to receiving information? Are you distracted by a phone? Like really thinking of the intentionality to show the importance of the conversation, I think is so critical for those type of settings. And thinking a little bit too more broadly about the sense of stigma that can be associated with seeking assistance around mental health issues. And not to date myself, but as an older adult, it's interesting to kind of see how that has shifted to, if I think of myself as a teen, we were instructed, like, you didn't talk with anybody outside your family about things. And if there were, like, mental health challenges, they weren't articulated. And now you see young people, adults, just kind of across the spectrum, and I don't want to paint with too broad of strokes, but in a lot of instances, being more open about that and seeking assistance or connecting with a therapist or, calling a hotline doesn't necessarily seem to have the same, like, taboo feeling to it as it had before. So, I view that kind of with my rose-colored glasses, but with a hopeful lens that as community continues to talk about that it allows people the space to seek out the resources without being worried about kind of, any sort of imaging or anything that goes along with that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I don't even know, as I was driving over today, I was trying to reflect back on when I was younger, and I don't even know if sort of mental health was, I don't even know if I knew that phrase,
Right.
I don't know if that was something that was even discussed, or if conversations around that took place anywhere, which is maybe part of why I grew up to become a therapist. But I do think that there's been significant shifts in how people are viewing mental health. I think there's been shifts in sort of research and what we know about mental health. And yes, I think there's a long ways to go still, but I think stigma around it is reducing. I think it still exists, but I do think it's reducing. I think people are much more open about talking about it. I think young people are really driving those conversations, which is great to see. So yeah, it's exciting. Again, I think there's a lot of work,
Yes.
but yeah, I think there is a lot more that's happening with regards to that.
I think too, really, the centering of teen voice on this, you think of just where we're seeing different images and youth really taking the lead to be like, these are things we want to talk about and they matter to us. And it gives me such a sense of pride in the young people in the community, the poise that they display at such a young age, and their willingness, again, to talk about things that are difficult. And,
Absolutely.
I wonder, we talked for a moment just about social media platforms. So, that is, I feel like, the definition of a double-edged sword. Can be helpful for resources and other things,
Yeah.
but also the sense of never being disconnected, I think is just, can feel like a real burden as well, or the sense of being performative, right? Like the life you show to people, is that actually what's going on with you? So I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think, you know, there's a lot of research out there. I don't know the extent of it. It's not something that I've, you know, read enough about, but I think it's exactly what you said. I think it's a double-edged sword. I think, you know, we did a digital wellness campaign a few years back, actually. And one of the things we talked about is sort of looking at that balance of sort of both the positives and the negatives when it comes to digital engagement. And I think, you know, on one hand, you know, if we're talking about the pandemic, one of the things that was a benefit of access to, you know, not just social media, but any sort of, you know, phone or iPad or anything was that
it was a tool.
It was a tool for connection. And I know that's really simplifying it, but at a time, you know, when people really lost almost all means of connection with each other, that was one thing that people had. And so I think we also have to think about, it's not just about the tool itself, but also how we're using it. You know, and I think there are lots of ways in which that is still a tool that's beneficial for people, even when we're talking about information sharing and people connecting through those different tools, whether it's social media or not. And I'm not, you know, I'm not promoting that, but I'm just saying I think there can be benefits to it. And yes, I think there are also certainly a lot of negative impacts to those tools and to using those tools as well that we know impact mental health as well in a not great way.
I think it's one of those, I think we use the caveat, proceed with caution. So I think you and I could spend a lot more time discussing this, and I think that I've already have some ideas for some follow-up, quite honestly.
Yeah.
So as we're coming to an end, can you talk a little about Let's Talk Workshop?
Oh, so what I would love to do is, I know, you know, we talked very briefly today about sort of how to talk to your teen or a teen around mental health, and I'd love to do something that's more expansive around that and just allows adults, caregivers, other people in the community, provides them with a little bit more information around how to talk to teens around their mental health, and also allows them for input, feedback around those conversations as well, and answers any questions they may have.
I think there'll be more to come on that. We're happy to promote that through this channel, and if people are looking for information, they can always contact the city's Health and Human Services Department for more information. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on today, Hallory, and talk about this really important conversation. You know, it sounds sometimes like a bumper sticker, but like these young people really are our future, so we really want to spend a lot of time providing them as much support as possible. So thank you again, I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad I could be here.
Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.